Hello and welcome to Honey Badger Radio 66. Pause for potential funny banter in the back. Nope. Okay. All right. The name, name
Root?
of the Route 66,
There
Order
you go.
66. The almost the number of the beast. Maybe
There
one
you
more six, and there we are.
One more.
Yeah. Okay. So tonight we're going to be talking about mothers and sons with our special guest Tom Golden. If you don't know who Tom Golden is, he's been on our show several times in the past to discuss men's mental health issues, and he's also written a book that's actually very dear to my heart. It's called Swallowed by a Snake, The Gift of the Masculine Side of Grief. And he also has a new book out called Helping Mothers Be Closer to Their Sons. And if you're interested in that one, it's on Amazon. And it's available as a Kindle ebook or as paperback. And I highly recommend Tom Golden's writing because it's very accessible and quite readable. He's a great storyteller, as well as a very caring, compassionate individual. So yeah, our special guest is Tom Golden, and we have our usual suspects: Mike Stevenson.
I'll do. Carry on.
Okay, Dr. Randomer Cam, got the Doge, Brian Martinez, and Hannah Wallen. So, without further ado, I shall step off the stage and hand it to my right-hand Doge.
Okay, so, Mr. Golden, we were looking at your book, the book on helping mothers to be closer to their sons.
Yeah.
Understanding the unique world of boys. Now, I wanted to ask you first, what made you want to write this book? What was the thing that made you say, "Oh, this is something I need to talk about"?
I've written 2 books for men. One was Swallowed by a Snake that Allison was kind enough to mention. The other one is one called The Way Men Heal. And I've just focused on men, and I realized that there's so many single mothers out there, and there's so many mothers out there who really don't have a clue about boys and their differences. So I thought, you know what? I need to write a book for them. Write a book that would make the way boys grow up accessible to them so they'd know. Because women are at a disadvantage. I mean, they did not grow up with a penis. They just didn't. And so there's things they don't know about boys that they can't know because they didn't experience it. I mean, think about it. How many times have you as a man ever heard the words, "you're not dealing with your feelings"?
All the time.
All the time. Now, next question, was it a man or a woman who asked you that?
Usually a woman.
Almost always a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what I think we need to talk a little bit about tonight, is that the men already know. They know a lot of the stuff that's in that book because they grew up with a dick. They grew up being boys. They grew up in the rough and tumble area. They grew up in a way that women didn't grow up. And the real kicker is that our media has completely failed in getting across the uniqueness of boys. There's been a huge amount of research in the last 20 years about boys. I mean, just an amazing stuff that we can talk about tonight that is really helpful to learn about how boys are different and how to then get close to them. Because you can't get close to someone when you're saying, "You're not dealing with your feelings." You're going to push him away. He doesn't want to hear that crap.
Yes, actually, that's actually really great that you bring that up. When we do look at what the media and academia talks about, when it talks about boys and the way they operate, the way that they function, the way they deal with pain, the way that they essentially act out, from as early as when they're in their terrible twos, if not before that, there seems to be a lack of curiosity, a lack of wanting to understand boys' brains.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I wonder if your book is also kind of like, if you thought, are there any books out here that are talking about boys in the way that I want to talk about them? Is this something that is just seriously lacking?
Precisely.
Yeah.
The things that I've seen a lot of times are, the boys need to learn how to emote. They need to learn how to, cry in public. And it's like, no, that's not right at all. And there's very little information out there that's accessible to people that teaches them really the way boys are. And it's a little tricky, of course, because boys aren't just one way. There's zillions of ways that boys are, but there's some general trends that you can look at that help you to kind of negotiate your relationship with them.
Yeah. Actually, let's get into one of the things that I thought was really interesting. Could you talk a little bit about the what you call the testosterone flood?
Yeah.
And how early this begins and how it sort of shapes boys.
Yeah, you were saying that boys, start being different when they're 2, and I kind of cringed because really they start being different the very first day after birth. They've done some research and they found that boys right after they're born, like within 24 hours, they will attend with their eyes to a mobile while the girls will attend to a human face. Now, it's not an all or nothing kind of thing, but generally the boys will tend to mobiles, the girls will tend to the human face. But why? Why could that be? Why are there differences in the first day? There's no socialization at all. Why could that be? And the answer is that about 6 months before, 6 or 7 months before, there's this thing that's called a testosterone flood. And, we've known about this testosterone flood since the 1950s, and maybe even before that. But most people have never heard of it before. But what happens is, in utero, when the baby's about 2 months old, you get this flood of testosterone, which then literally changes the brain. And it turns the brain into what researchers are calling the male brain, or the systems brain. The male brain, they found, is interested in systems-oriented sorts of things. And the female brain is more an empathic brain, more interested in relationship kinds of things. Now remember, this is not 100% one and 100% the other. It's not black and white. There's plenty of gray in between. But in general, that's what happens, is this testosterone flood changes the brain of boys into the systems-oriented piece that is very different. We know now there's 4 basic changes that happen with the testosterone flood that the scientists now are sure of. And one is sexual orientation. Our sexual orientation is impacted by this testosterone flood.
Mm.
The next is gender identity. Whether we think we're a boy or a girl is impacted by this testosterone flood. Now that's huge. Both of those are huge. But then the third one is the play behaviors, and the sex-differentiated behaviors in childhood are also impacted by the testosterone flood, and somewhat aggression is impacted. So boys are probably being a little bit more likely to be aggressive. Girls will be less likely to be aggressive. Boys will be more likely to play in big groups and to rough and tumble stuff, and the girls will be more likely to play with an individual. So, we know those 4 things are impacted by this testosterone flood, and there's probably more. They're finding out things every day. They've now found out that there's what's called the mini puberty, which happens within the first 3 months after birth. Little boys get this rush of testosterone, and any parent who's had a little boy knows that, my God, this little guy, he's getting erections. Why is he getting erections, And he's getting erections because he's flooded with testosterone. And they know almost nothing about the impact of that. But they're guessing that this, along with the testosterone flood and some genetic material, they're thinking all these things together are changing boys in a very profound sort of way.
Someone in the chat had, there were a couple of questions. One person asked, is there also an estrogen flood? And I would also want to add that this testosterone flood, it actually does also impact a small number of girls as well as boys.
Yes, and we call those girls tomboys.
Mm-hmm. And they basically end up with more sort of male brains, sort of.
Exactly. And the interest in, these girls that have the extra testosterone tend to be more like the little boys. They want to go out and play rough. They want to climb trees. They don't want to, play with dresses. They want to go out and compete. And it's fascinating, that this stuff is related to our in utero experience. We're born that way. But, as far as the estrogen flood goes, I have no idea. That's a fascinating question. I'd like to know. But I've never heard of it. I think I've probably been more interested in the testosterone side of things and have neglected the estrogen side.
Yeah. And then like you said that in your little write-up, I guess we all start off female, and the testosterone flood essentially changes us into boys. Is that?
Yes.
Am I reading that right? Okay.
I think that's the way scientists would say that it happens. Is that the basic brain that we start with is female, and the testosterone flood changes that to make boys unique and very different.
Okay. Yeah. No. That's and then so we have a massive change that happens to embryos in utero that makes them into boys, or at least it has a large impact on their sexuality and stuff, and that's the testosterone flood. That's within 3 months of them, 3 or 4 months in the womb still, and then there's another what they call the mini puberty that happens about 3 months. 3 months after the child is born.
It's right after they're born, and it sometimes can last up to 3 months, and I think sometimes a little bit longer. And they don't know much about it yet. They haven't really nailed it down, but they do know it's going to be a whole lot easier to study the mini puberty because the testosterone levels are easier to take when you got a baby that's born. The testosterone levels in utero are tough to both take and to measure and to keep good records of. So they're going to have an easier time, I think, with the mini puberty.
So this already kind of flies in the face of a couple theories, which I think are very interesting. One is mainly the idea that that this stuff is all socialized. Now, maybe some of it is, but it appears that there's a lot of chemical stuff going on. And you say that we've known about this since the 50s, but for whatever reason, even though it's been known by scientists for that long, the average person doesn't appear to know it.
Right.
And that is pretty interesting to me.
Yes.
So now that we know that, then I guess the next thing is what is something that a mother who wants to learn about her son can get from this knowledge, this knowledge about the this testosterone that's boys are being hit with at various stages of their development, and this is way before puberty. How does this inform those mothers? Like, what do you think makes it useful to them?
Well, there's all kinds of things that make it useful, but even for the little guys, they're not going to have the same kind of attraction to eye contact that the little girls are going to have. And even little guys that are 3 years old, 5 years old, they're going to be much more likely to want to do something shoulder to shoulder, something with you, rather than sit face to face and talk. And so right off the bat, we know that this is the case for boys. I mean, most boys. Now remember, there's going to be probably 10 to 20% of boys who are going to be more like the girls. They're going to want to talk about their feelings, and that's fine. And there's going to be about 10 to 20% of the girls who are going to want to be more like the boys. We need to learn to love both of them. We need to learn to love the very masculine women and the very feminine guys. And it's just what we need to do is keep our eyes open to see how each person is different. Each person's unique, and not judge them for that. Just say, wow, they're like that. How about that?
So when boys turn out to be more feminine, is it because they didn't get as much testosterone during that flood in that early stage? Or is it because they didn't get one at all? Or how is there any in more detail about that?
It's a gray area. So that I think the more testosterone you have, the more likely you're going to be Marlboro Man-esque. The less testosterone, the more you're going to be on the feminine side. And the same thing would be true for the girls with their amounts of testosterone they get in utero.
And Hannah had a good question in the chat here. She asked, does the testosterone flood cause any side effects in the mother that's carrying the child, as well as maybe the father? Because I know that when women are pregnant, the fathers also experience hormonal biological changes.
Yes.
So
that's a fascinating question, and I don't know the answer to it, but I do know that most of the testosterone is produced by the mother. So if she's having a bad reaction to it, it's from something she herself has produced. Because testosterone in women, I think, can produce, is it the ovaries that do it? I forget where it is or what gland it is that secretes the testosterone. But I mean, most of it comes from mom. And then I think at 3 months, the little boys can start producing testosterone from their testes. I am not certain of that, but I think that's the way it works.
You know what? I'll look it up in a moment.
Look it up.
Yeah, I'll look it up in a moment.
Yeah.
Okay, so next question.
But you mentioned something that I wanted to touch on real briefly, and that is the whole socialization thing. You know, we've been told for years that everything is socialization. And so we're all kind of primed in that direction. And they're partly right. I mean, we're not also saying now that it's all testosterone flood. The testosterone flood is a tiny piece of what makes us who we are. And we can combine that with the socialization, with our hormones, with our genetics, and with everything. You put it all together to make a beautiful mix. But it's not one thing, it's everything. You know, we know that hormones impact our socialization. Socialization impacts our genetics. Our genetics impacts both of those. I mean, it's like this thing swirling around. It's just so complex that we're probably just have a tiny, tiny piece of what really happens so far. But we know that they all work together, and we don't want to try and look at one as being the biggie and the other one as being, you know, non-existent, like we've been doing for 50 years. You know, where we look at socialization as the only thing. That's bull.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with that 100%. So the next, okay, so we're going to talk about single mothers for a second, because in this current social cultural climate, especially in lower income areas in the States, there is a growing number of childhood criminality, like from boys, and even with girls, there are problems with dysfunction, with delinquency, and when you look at people who are, for example, in prison or who are criminals, and they're interviewed and they're spoken to and all this, there's a lot of there seems to be a common sort of thread, and that common thread is single motherhood. And this is not to bash on single mothers, but rather to understand the root of it, because sociologists and psychologists will say, typically, that the problem is that there is something wrong with men, that there is men have an inherent, you know, predisposition to violence, to domination, to you know, aggression, intimidation, etc. And this is what, you know, they call this toxic masculinity, and it's not just a feminist thing. This is actually very common in just people that work in these soft sciences, that people that work in psychology and all that. But from what we know, it seems that that is actually, when you do that, you're starting the story in the middle, and you're not actually going back far enough to understand where this may come from.
Yes.
And so I think that this is the reason why this book could be very useful, because when you have the larger public believing that boys and girls are the same, and the only thing that makes them different is that they socialize that way, and the only thing that you need to do to fix all the problems is to essentially try to change by socializing into children. You know, you try to change their behavior, change their preferences, and it's like they're just these sort of they just come out and they're these blobs of clay, and you just get to mold them however you like. But that's not really how it works.
Right.
So, and then single mothers, because there are single fathers too, and I want to get into that as well. But when you look at the numbers and the statistics, there are much higher degrees of child abuse in single mother households, or single parent households rather, or households where there are step parents that are raising children that are not theirs. And there is also, from those same places, there are increased levels of, you know, childhood delinquency, runaways. You know, they get into substance abuse. They get the girls, they hit puberty earlier and they become pregnant. You know, that teen pregnancy thing is very common. And so, and a lot of that is also rooted in child abuse as well, which often comes from single parents. So the question is, what, aside from everything I said, what are the potential sort of root causes for single mothers raising children, and how does that perhaps differ from single fathers? And have you considered the idea that, let's say you have a, God, this is turning into a really complex question, but let's say you have a single mom and she is actually more of a tomboy, but she had children. Does that actually affect her ability to be a nurturing person, or does that actually make her more adaptable? Do you follow what I'm saying, or should I just rephrase?
Barely.
Okay.
I think that, yeah, I think testosterone is certainly a part of it. You know, they found that when women are given testosterone, their cognitive empathy goes down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of an interesting piece, but I think above all of this, the most important factor is fatherlessness.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, without a dad in the home, things fall to crap. You know?
Yeah.
And so one of the things that single mothers can do is make sure to have the father involved. If they can't get the father involved, get some loving man involved who cares about the kids. Get a masculine presence in the home as much as you possibly can, because they're going to be able to do things with your son that you can't do.
Okay.
That's my take on it anyway. But I wonder if everybody else may have some ideas about this.
Yeah, I want to put it out to anybody who also has any thoughts on this. Like, I know Hannah is a parent, so I don't know if there's anything that you can speak to, because I don't have any kids. So.
Well, I suppose with respect to differences between mothers and fathers and their effects on the kids, I know there are things that I'm not going to say that I just leave a bunch of stuff to my husband. But there are times when I feel like it's absolutely vital that I not be the only one involved in a particular situation. Like when my son wanted to talk about things like dating and girls and stuff like that, I had insight and everything, but you cannot be the only person that talks to your kid about that. Both of us talk to the girls. Both of us talked to our son. And I think there are things that there's just no way for me to know them simply because I haven't had the experiences that a man who has grown up dating girls would be able to tell a boy that a mother, even a mother that dated girls, wouldn't be able to tell a boy about being a boy and dating girls. And if there's something as, you know, simple as the difference in how to deal with emotions that come up or deal with lack of understanding that happens between the sexes, and these are things that you can sort of learn the hard way, but without the parents' influence, there's a big difference there. But I think probably one of the biggest difference that I noticed personally in my life was the difference in approaches to, and I think I brought this up before, my illness between my two parents. And both of them had a functional approach. Then both of their approaches were necessary in order for me to survive. My mom wanted to protect me from the things that were threatening my life immediately. And so she did things like altering the physical environment I was living in to protect me from having asthma attacks right then and there. Kept it especially clean in the house, made sure we had air conditioning, things like that. Took me to the doctor, made sure I had the medicines I needed. My dad wanted to give me, with Mom wanting to give me the shield to defend myself against it, my dad wanted to give me the sword to fight it off. And he's the one that went to my athletic events and watched me struggle. And it was a hard struggle, and it was a lot harder for them to watch than it was for me to actually be involved in. And my dad was the one that was tough enough to watch me nearly suffocate in order to strengthen my lungs and not stop me from doing that, even though it was terrifying for him. And I don't think my mom would have been able to, and I don't think most women would have been able to. So there's a big difference there.
Yeah. Hannah, would you consider yourself a tomboy when you were young?
I was kind of an odd mix. It had to be explained to me when I was about 8 years old that I could not climb trees in a dress. And that ribbons and bows were a detriment out on the football field. And if you look at my hands, like Karen has talked about the ring finger thing. Before my fingers were twisted with a little bit of arthritis, they were the same length, my ring finger and my index finger. So it's kind of funny that she says that. So I have that, but at the same time, I'm not entirely a tomboy. I think I'm less of a tomboy than Karen was when she was growing up, and I can go back in time and look at some of the things that we would refer to as toxic feminism or femininity, sort of in mockery of the claim of toxic masculinity. I've had those in my life. I can exhibit those. So yeah.
So now wait, this is kind of interesting. So you sound like you were at least somewhat a tomboy, even if you probably still liked some girly things. And Karen was definitely a tomboy. Allison, are you there? Were you a tomboy? Would you consider yourself a tomboy? Allison? All right, I'm going to wait till she gets... She wants to either be mysterious or whatever. I wonder if that's not just like a badgery trait.
Well, I can tell you one thing about her. She was a wrestler.
Yeah, I know. No, I know. She did martial arts and stuff.
Yeah.
I think that Allison was probably a tomboy too, but I'm not gonna make any assumptions. But okay, so that first off, that's just interesting. But I think that it actually kind of makes sense in many ways.
Yes, it does.
Because the fact that you guys are all interested in men's issues and you have an interest in the way men think and operate as a sort of a without passing judgment, says that at least on some level your sort of more male-ish brains. I don't want to say that they're male brains, but they're the tomboy part of your personality is probably that there may be some relationship. But also, Hannah, you are a mother. Do you have how many? Could you tell us in like really really vaguely how many kids and how many sons and daughters?
Well, I'm not going to be vague. I gave birth to a son. I have 2 stepdaughters, and so I didn't get to raise them from infancy. I only got to raise them for part of their lives, and they didn't live with us. But my son has been with me for his entire life.
Right. Okay. And is he about how old is he now?
It just hit me this week that he's going to be old enough in February to have to sign up for selective service.
Oh, okay. So he's getting to that legal age of consent age.
Yeah,
or legal age to
talking to anybody.
He gets to be disposable.
So yeah, exactly. So now that you have a son and you've raised him for a long period of time, what kind of what kind of relationship do you think you had with your son? Did you try to and I wonder if your more tomboyish nature could have played into this. So I'm curious about these connections. But when you were raising your son, did you find, oh, this is going to be really difficult because he's a boy and I'm not, and how is this going to work out? Did you have those sort of apprehensive thoughts, or did you just without getting too personal, if you don't?
Oh no, I can get personal about it, because the first challenge that I faced was a lot of people in my life treating my relationship situation with my husband. We weren't married when we got pregnant. We did not plan well, and I did stupid stuff, and we ended up putting the cart well before the horse. And so my first challenge was, and my first big fear was that, he wasn't going to get enough time with Dad, because I was living with my parents, recovering from a car accident, and my husband was living with his parents, recovering from a divorce from, his ex-wife sort of arranged things before the divorce so that he could not fulfill his duties at his job and his duties as a father. And he chose his duties as a father, and he got fired. And so my family treated him like a deadbeat until we both stepped up and showed that that was not the case. But we were stuck living apart for 5 years, and it was a huge struggle because I was terrified that that was going to deprive our son of something vital. And we worked very hard to make sure that we got time together, and I worked hard to make sure that, they had time without me, because there's a tendency to want to interfere when dad does something different than mom would do. And that's a big struggle to, like, no, I would do that differently. Here, let me help you. Well, he doesn't need help. If he's, he doesn't need a safety net. Mom doesn't have to be a safety net. He knows how to do this, and he's done this with 2 other children before mine. So, there were times when I just, like, got my ass out of there and let him do what he's going to do. And then there were times when the 3 of us did things together, and there were times when the 5 of us did things together, and there were times when we did things with my family and with his family, just like any normal family does. But I was also really grateful for my dad's influence, because, my dad grandfathers every bit as beautifully, maybe even more beautifully than he fathers. And it was a huge privilege to get to see that, the way that I got to see it, living with them for a while before we got our shit together and got our own place and everything. And so my focus with our son was, making things as normal as I could, and making things as easy on my husband as I could, for him to make things as normal as he could. And there was a lot, of other stuff going on there too, because not getting to live with his sisters, that's hard. Not getting to see them, and then having them come in and be the focus because they're not there all the time, and everything. That was kind of, that was a big challenge. And there was also, the relationship that I had with each of the kids was a little different, because it's just that way with your kids. Each kid has a different personality. You can't have the exact same relationship with all of them. And so you seek a connection based on the child's developing personality, and you seek to guide and bring out the child's strong characteristics and their best characteristics, and you look at where they need help overcoming hurdles and developing their character in a way that's going to make them into a person who's going to have the best time they can have in their life, with society, with work, with whatever career they want to have, with the relationships they want to form, and so on. And that's basically what I did. That's basically what I worked on. And with my son, it was very different than it was with his sisters, because his focus on things was very different. His play was very different. And I noticed that he was quicker to pick up on things like my work ethic, things like if I tried making stupid excuses for things that I had no excuse for, he would do the same thing. He took cues from me that I noticed the girls didn't, or they were slower to take from me. And I don't know if it was because he was with me all the time and they weren't, or if it was because boys have a different perception of their mother than their father, and girls have that perception of their father versus their mother. But I really had to watch myself and make sure that I showed him the best person I could show him, because he was going to pick up on it very much if I didn't. And I also noticed that it affected what kind of girls he chose to hang out with and how he chose to let them treat him. So I guess that's kind of, that. And I also noticed that he had a lot more fun with me if I engaged the building and creating and puzzle solving into his brain than he did if it was just, just the companionship aspect. It was a lot more fun to hang out together if we were making something, or figuring out something, or if we were going to watch something or play a game, it needed to be more cerebral than tugging on your heartstrings. So that's what I did.
Yeah. We're gonna get into that because I think Tom writes about that in his book. Like how to sort of bond with your boy if you're a mother.
Yeah, great job, Hannah.
Oh, thanks.
Nice.
Yeah. So going back to the single parent thing, okay. Do you know if there are any potential consequences for single fathers raising children in the same way that there is evidence of consequences? I guess consequences is a strong word. Correlation between young adult criminality and stuff and being raised in a single parent home. Is there a difference in your opinion between single fathers raising children and single mothers? Now, we do know that there is a preponderance of single mothers versus single fathers, but do the results sort of pan out the same way? Do you know if there's anything to that, Tom?
Well, it's an interesting question because the group of women who are single mothers is very different from the group of men who are single fathers. The group of mothers who are single mothers are a pretty varied group, but the group of fathers who are single fathers are very unusual men. I mean, not your usual guys. So it's hard to compare those two groups because of that. But I think that it's important for us to know that the fatherlessness research is very clear. They've gone beyond the idea of correlation, and they're talking now about causation. They literally are saying they have the data to show that fatherlessness causes some of these things. That's huge. I mean, have you ever heard of a social science research project that has causation involved? No, that's completely unbelievable. So they literally know now that fatherlessness literally causes some of this stuff. I mean, it's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and actually you make a really great point about how men who end up single fathers are a specific type of man because to get custody of your kids over the mother,
yes,
you would have to be an amazing dad.
And you got to have money.
And yes, and you have to come from
influence.
Yes, exactly.
And so it's a different group, completely different group.
Yes. So
great group, by the way. I love these guys. I mean, they're doing great work.
Absolutely.
Yeah, man.
So it does make it really difficult to compare the two. So it's not because there's something that is inherent to fathers per se, or inherent to mothers that does the opposite, but rather that there are things that because of the way that things sort of shake out when you have these child custody disputes. This is going to give us some pretty completely different areas, in terms of numbers and stuff. So,
yes.
So in the when Hannah was talking about her, the way that she interacted with her boy.
Yeah.
And she said that it was more sort of fulfilling for him, and it allowed them to bond better when they were engaged in an activity.
Yeah.
That he found stimulating.
Exactly.
Yes.
And puzzles, figuring something out. I mean, that's where he shines. That's where he loves to figure things out. He loves to do things together, shoulder to shoulder. And she picked up on it right away, and I'm sure that really helped her with the relationship with her son. He loves it, I'm sure. His mom could do that.
Yeah. And one of the things that you mentioned, there's a chapter in your book called storytelling.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if you could tell us a little bit about how storytelling could be used as a tool to get closer to your son, and specifically also these sort of telling stories as a group, or telling stories where you make them a part of that experience.
Yeah, the whole storytelling thing is so critical for all children, but boys in particular. Because what happens when think back when you were a little guy and someone said, "I'm going to tell you a story." I mean, what's the first thing you do?
Oh, you get comfortable.
Exactly, you get comfortable, you get relaxed, and that means we let our guard down. We're just going to be open to the story. So immediately you're putting your kids and your boys in a position that's receptive and open. And that's a great thing for these little guys. And then you tell them a story. And oh my gosh, there's so many great stories out there. You know, the Grimm's fairy tales are wonderful to tell kids. You know, they used to use stories, the Grimm's fairy tales, as literally school work. I mean, the stories would teach as they talked. You know, the stories were a part of their education. And we've lost that completely because children love stories. And one of the things I found out with my own kids was that they love stories where they're a part of things. And boys absolutely adore this. You know, you can tell a spontaneous story. You can make something up. You guys were out in the woods one day, and you, Johnny, you found a raccoon's nest, you know, and you just keep going. And Jimmy, you did such, you know, you just keep going and going, and they're just completely enthralled. And then they'll start saying, oh yeah, and I did this, you know, and you go with that, you go with them, you kind of flow with what they're saying, and they get involved in the story, and it's just a lot of fun, and they really enjoy it, and they don't forget it. You know, it just brings it's a wonderful memory for both the kids and the parents to be involved with this. I had the ice cream story, which I used to tell my kids that they just absolutely loved, and they begged me to tell it over and over again. In fact, they still beg me, and they're in their 20s now, you know. And it was just a very intimate time when you can tell a story. You get really close because you're not judging, you're not saying that they're wrong, you know, you're just kind of being together. And boys like to just be. You know, think about two men in a fishing boat. Women will not understand this, but the guys will. You know, two men in a fishing boat can sit there all frickin' day fishing. They might say something about the bait. They might say something about the local sports team, but they're not going to talk most of the day. They walk away from that experience feeling close.
Mm-hmm.
They feel close to that guy because they shared an experience together. To me, this is a very developed way to be close. In some ways, in my mind, more close than talk, talk, talk. You know, the men are just being together. It's a beautiful thing. And the shed movement now in Australia and some in Ireland and England, and I'm hoping we're going to do some here, is doing just that. It's getting men together, shoulder to shoulder, to do things together, to tell stories together, to be together. And that's what we need. You know, that's what we need for our young men, that's what we need for our old men, and we need it for the men in between. You know, a place that's safe, that you can simply be and tell your story and feel admired and respected. You know, because admiration and respect are the two keys to masculinity. You know, the boys need to be fed respect and admiration. When you admire a young boy, your son, he will start doing anything for you. You know, he will make his bed, he'll do this or that through that admiration, because he's working to get that admiration. You know, very different from the girls, who usually the girls want to be cared for. They want to know that you care about them. They want to know that you're close to them. You know, it's kind of the same thing, but it's a little bit different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no. The boys want the opportunity to earn something,
and to succeed.
To succeed at something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so it's a little bit different. It's actually, well, I mean, that's actually one of the things that we're sort of running into with trying to help men with men's rights activism is a lot of times what men that are in trouble are more often looking for is not a handout so much as an opportunity to essentially lift themselves out of whatever their situation is, or tools that they can take advantage of to use to go out and basically take some action against or for, you know, something that they have a goal in mind for, you know, to go out and get something. But they want the opportunity to do it. And the opportunity for that comes from a place where you say, I want to help you, and I want to help you by helping you help yourself. And so that's something that I think most of the time, you know, guys want. It's not so much to be treated like a charity case, but more so to essentially be treated like, you know, a peer. And to be said, I know you can do this thing. You just need a little push, and I'm going to give you the push.
Yes. And
so
why do you think that is?
I think because men like to take action. They want to take pride in something that they accomplish.
Yes. And I would add on to that plus testosterone.
Yeah.
You know, because testosterone, we know now The testosterone is not about aggression, and it's not about violence. Testosterone is about striving for status. Striving for status. And this is what fuels men and boys. They want to strive for status, and once they get that status, they want to feel like they are respected and admired. But that's a very, very different approach than what we've been talking about when Alan Aldous, said men are testosterone poisoned, which is bullshit. This stuff pushes men to strive to be better and better and better. And they do that. I mean, look at what men competing against each other over the years has built cultures. It's what has built everything. It's what has pushed people to explore, pushed people to create theories. It's this male-to-male competition that's driven by this testosterone, which tells men, strive for status. Try and do this a little bit harder. You see this in boys. The other thing about the testosterone flood is that the testosterone flood does something else that's important. It primes the receptors in the brain to be sensitive to testosterone in the future. So that those people, women and men, who got this testosterone flood, when they get a little bit of testosterone, it's going to have a big impact. If they didn't get the flood, they get the same amount of testosterone, but it's not going to have the same impact. So men are usually sensitized to even small amounts of testosterone, and they're pushed to strive for that status, in their own way. Everybody's got a different way to strive,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, going back to the stories thing, I was just thinking, when I was a kid, I loved adventure stories. I was really big into Greek mythology. I love stories of heroism.
Yeah.
And I still do, obviously. But those were my favorite things as a kid. Now, I even, my parents were really Catholic, super religious, and they got me this book when I was a kid. It was called The Golden Book of Bible Stories. And essentially, they were stories from the Old Testament and some from the New Testament that were essentially written in such a way that a child could understand them. I was probably 10 years old or something when I was reading these books.
Right.
And even those stories, especially the Old Testament ones, I found really interesting. Like, I thought they were, really exciting, like the Greek stuff, like Beowulf, like Treasure Island, and all these other things that followed. Tarzan, the Three Musketeers, I loved all that stuff.
Yes.
Now, in schools today, adventure stories are very hard to come by. There are a lot of storytelling that boys, I think, because I would say that in that regard I was a typical boy. And besides the sort of the fiction stuff and fairy tales that I'm talking about, I also really liked anything that dealt with dinosaurs and the planets. I thought that was super cool too.
All right.
So, but I don't think that that's abnormal for boys. I think that those are pretty common
Of course,
things.
yeah.
But that stuff's not really as common now. So I think that what that means for me anyway is that storytelling and doing that stuff with your children is even more important, especially as a mother, but also as a father, because they may not get those stories in academia, in schools.
Yes, that's
because
right.
those things are not as they're more likely to read more sort of emotional stuff is actually what they're putting in schools.
Schools have been feminized.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely right.
So, what about this stories for older adolescents?
Yeah, the Trickster Tales.
Yeah,
oh my gosh, there's this group of stories called the Trickster Tales by a guy, Paul Radin, I think was the man who translated them. But he got them straight from the Winnebago tribe. And these stories are unbelievable. I mean, I used to tell one a week for my kids when they got to be teenagers. And their friends would come over to listen to them. I mean, it was like that interesting, I mean, Trickster is the character, and he does all sorts of unbelievable things. He carries his penis around in a pack in his back, and he takes it out when he wants to. And he said, in this one story, he sent it across the lake to go have sex with the chief's daughter, but the penis was too high in the water, so he called him back. He said, no, you're too high, she'll see you. And so he tied a rock on it, but it was too low, so he called him back again. And then it was just right. The penis went all the way across the lake and started having wonderful sex with the chief's daughter. The chief's daughter didn't know what to do, and the story goes on and on and on. And you can imagine adolescents are going, oh my God, my father's telling the story. But what it's doing is it's bringing issues up to them in story form that they're dealing with just about every day. The whole issue of sexuality, forced sexuality, is an issue now in this trickster story, told in a way that's funny and easy to talk about, but it's very gripping stuff. Another one, this one on arrogance, where a trickster is walking through the woods and he hears this little white thing say, "You will poop if you eat me." And Trickster said, "No, I won't." And just repeating, "You will poop if you eat me." "No, I won't." And they get in this big argument, right? Trickster says, "Oh yeah?" He grabs the little white fruit, he eats it. He says, "See?" And then suddenly, Trickster starts defecating. And he defecates more and more and more until finally he's floating on top of his own poop, struggling to pull himself up with the trees to keep out of his own poop. And finally it's above the trees. He can no longer hold on to the trees, and boom, down to the bottom of the forest floor he falls. And it's all this crap, and he's just trying to blindly get through this huge ton of shit. And he finally gets to the edge, and he finds water, and he cleans himself off. But you see, that's the kind of story that they have. And then you talk about arrogance, He didn't think that was going to affect him. What about that? I mean, and so these are great stories for adolescents. Anybody out there listening, please read these stories first before you tell them to your children and before you give them the book. These are very intense and raw stories.
And what's the name of it again?
The Trickster Tales, I think, is the name of the book.
Trickster Tales, yeah.
And I think the fellow's name is, it's either Raiden or Roden. I think it's Raiden. But it's an absolutely fascinating series of tales about Trickster that are great for adolescents, because adolescents love these raw, bawdy stories that literally are touching on all of their stuff. And so for mothers to be able to read this to their sons, it might be a way for them to connect in. The stories are a safe way to connect in with boys and with girls. And the Trickster Tales are fascinating. I still have kids coming up to me who are in their 20s saying, "I remember that story you told when I was 13. It's like they don't forget this stuff.
Yeah.
It stays in their biocomputer. And it's a wonderful thing, and it's a wonderful way for a parent to get close with their kids.
Another thing I would also recommend is a great website called guysread.com. And it has a lot of books on there that have boys' interests in mind. So
yes.
I recommend that book, that website as well.
Indeed.
And another thing is, okay, so let's talk a little bit about competing. As a mother, it's one of the things you have a chapter about. Compete with your son.
Yes.
Challenge them.
Yes.
And use their interests when you compete with them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Guys love a challenge. Guys love a challenge. If he's not making his bed, say, "I'll bet you, so much that you can't make that bed in 45 seconds." "Oh yeah? Yeah. Okay, let's see." And then boom, he makes it in 45 seconds. You go, "Oh, nice job." I mean, you can be pretty sneaky with this stuff. But you use this competitive edge, because he wants to strive. He wants to get out there and get things done. You use that as a means to get what you want from them. It's a sneaky way in, but it can work. If you've got two sons, one of the things you can do is you say, "Okay, you both are going to get a really special treat if you both get all of your chores done. But if one of you doesn't get his chores done, neither of you gets a treat." So they push each other back and forth to get things done by the end of the week. You don't have to do diddly. They're out there pushing themselves because you're using their competitive nature to be able to win and succeed and be admired and respected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hannah?
I kind of noticed that with my son when he was little. One of my sort of tricks to help him learn reading and everything, which he was going to be good at it. I kind of figured that out when he was very young, that he was going to be an early reader and he was going to love reading and everything, was to get him involved in video games that, they weren't just the shooter video games, they weren't just the reflex video games, they were the story video games that had, you got to figure this out to get past this point. and that kind of thing. But there were also video games that would have, you know, achievements and side quests and things that had scores and things that, you know, he could beat me at, that I had played the games already. And like one of them was Breath of Fire 3 for people who would know. And you have the little fishing mini game and things like that. And one of his big challenges in those games was not just to conquer the game itself, but to do it better than I did.
Yes.
And
yes.
so I used to encourage it, but I didn't encourage it by telling him, "Oh, you can do this, you can do this." It was like, "Well, you're going to have to fight really hard because I'm still playing."
Yep.
You know. And I just got a better score now. You got to stretch for that. And things like that. And I push him with that, and I push him with some physical things too, because I didn't want him to end up with the same asthma issues as me. And I this he doesn't know, but I went to talk to his gym teacher because he had a tendency when he was very little you hit this wall with asthma where you like everybody hits this wall with exercise where you get to a point where your body's not getting enough oxygen, and you have to push through that wall if you want to do better at the exercise that you're doing. But with asthma, it feels like somebody's trying to smother you and strangle you, and it can be a little scary.
Huh.
And I told his gym teacher, because I knew he was not in a situation where his life was threatened the way my life was threatened when I was a kid by it. He just needed to work through it. His asthma was not, I was really lucky. He was lucky. His asthma was not as severe as mine. So I went to his gym teacher and I told him the situation. I said, you kind of watch and gauge, because he's going to know. He's educated in physical health and things. If you think he's slacking off, razz him. Get him off his butt, because I don't want him to end up developing worse asthma. And he did. He did exactly that. In elementary school, a gym teacher was consistently pushing, every week, pushing him to challenge himself in class to overcome that. And it helped a lot. It's, he went from being a kid that got sick all the time to being an adolescent that almost never gets sick.
All right.
And it took me till I was in my 30s to get to that almost never get sick point.
Huh.
So, yeah, you do have to challenge. And it wouldn't have been the same with the girls, I don't think. I think if somebody had challenged my daughters that way, one of them would have been okay. The other one would have folded up and gone home and said, "What do I do?" And we would have had to talk her into fighting. But part of the reason I understood that with my son is because I personally am a stubborn ass, and I learned it from my gym teacher. My gym teacher used to do this thing where if I looked like I was slacking off in gym class, he'd be like, "Oh, poor Hannah, it's really getting too rough to you. If you want to, you can sit this one out." And I'd be like, grumble and grumble, you're going to tell me I'm not able to do this, I'm going to get up and go. And I'd get out there and just about kill myself trying to do what the other kids were doing. And so I knew that, he could be perceptive. I just wanted to make sure that he knew that Mom wasn't going to come in there and whine on the kid's behalf. "You're being mean. Don't push my kid." And that's basically what I did.
All right. I want to. Okay, so next thing I want to get to is something that's very difficult that a lot of parents run into as a challenge, but especially single parents, and that is discipline. And you have a section on how specifically to discipline boys. Now, this I'm really interested in because, again, I think it's one of those things that we don't talk about enough. How do you discipline boys? And can you talk a little bit about doing that? And one of the things I think that's really interesting, because I think a lot of people these days, they're trying to get into sort of a nonviolent, nonviolent child rearing, or essentially, they want to try to raise children without having to spank them. They want to, try to be really, really good about that, and a lot of people are taking an interest in it, and it's sort of a growing trend. But that won't be easy to do if you don't understand the way boys work. So, can you talk a little bit about boys and discipline, and specifically the bit I like is like what I mentioned before, challenging them, but also try to come across with like, go for like a win-win kind of resolution,
Yes.
positive reinforcements, things like that.
Yes. I agree 100%. Go for the win-win, go for the challenge, and make it so that they can succeed. You try and make the discipline in such a way so that they will succeed, not that they're going to fail, because they will try hard to succeed, but they will react poorly if they know they're going to fail. But the whole discipline thing is a tough one, because it's so much easier if you have two parents.
Yeah.
If you have one parent, it just is very, very difficult because they can't. There's no good cop, bad cop thing going there. I mean, you got nothing. You've got one cop, and you got to be all of it, and you got to be the nice guy and the bad guy at the same time. And it's tough. It's tough. But with boys, if you can learn their nature, if you can learn that they are a little bit on the challenging side, they want to be challenged. If you can learn how they react to things, you're going to have an easier time in your discipline. There's a school in D.C. It's a modern day school, I think it's called, and they have when someone goes into that school, they are assigned either the blue team or the white team, and from that point on, everything they do in the school is points, and they get points for their team. And so you've got this competition going in the school. It's an all-boys school. You've got this competition going in the school between the white team and the blue team. And so all the deportment is a part of those points. Academia is a part of those points. Extracurricular stuff is part of those points. So you've got all the boys pushing everyone on their team to do better. That's a win. And these boys do very, very well because they're pushing themselves in order to get a prize, in order to succeed. Not you can't do this, you can't do that, blah, 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 blah. Boys are going to think, oh, you don't think I can do that? Well, let me check it out. Let me see what I can do.
Yeah.
So, if you can move more into the blue team and the white team, even make teams with your kids. If you've got more than 2 kids, do teams somehow there. Have fun with it. This doesn't have to be all terrible. The other thing with boys is they need to be a part of the rulemaking. If you have rules, have them be a part of making those rules. Have the boys be a part and say, okay, here's the rules, and I can go with that. And if you can, make them a part of what happens if you break those rules. And what happens a lot of times with single motherhood and single parenthood is when the child breaks the rules, the parent feels hurt. The parent feels like, how could they treat me like this? And so they respond back to the child in a way that's negative, and that's just not going to help. It's not going to help. So you want to set it up so that there's a win-win.
I like that. I really like that whole, get your children involved with making the rules.
Yes.
And with sort of deciding on what the consequences for breaking the rules might be.
Yes.
And I like that bit about the team, setting up the teams because you make it into a kind of a game. And then, like, before you know it, the kids are, they're playing along with this system.
Yes.
And boys do like rules
That's
because
right.
they like that structure. They
That's
like,
right.
But they also like feeling like they had a hand in it. Like it's not just some sort of totalitarianism that's coming from the top down that they can't actually control. Another thing that I think is also probably a really big part of it is as a parent, you have to make sure that you abide by the same standards that you're applying to your kid. Because if you act in a way that the boy can see is hypocritical, then he will feel like you don't have any respect for the system.
Yep, that's
because
it.
Boys are, they pay a lot of attention to that, right?
They pay a lot of attention to the system.
Yes.
Just watch them play.
Yes.
Boys that play, when they're playing a game with 2 teams, they do at least 50% of the time, they argue about the rules. The rules and the system are critical. The girls don't have the same kind of dynamic usually. But the boys, that system is just a critical piece. We're going to argue until we get it right. Because they want it fair. But the boys want it fair. And they're going to fight about it. And that's a good thing.
Hannah, were you going to say something?
Yeah, there was one of the things that you were talking about, the process of sort of negotiating when it comes to rules, my son kind of initiated that himself, and it was one of the differences that I noticed between the boys and the girls, and it was the same thing when I was a kid. My brother and me, I'd face no when I felt it was unfair, and it was kind of a stopping point for me at first.
Right.
And I noticed my brother would try to, negotiate. Well, how can I prove to you that I can handle this? If it was you're too young to do this, or I don't trust that you're going to be okay to do this. You can't go downtown by yourself, or whatever it was. And it was, what can I do to prove that I can do this?
Right.
He wouldn't necessarily put it that boldly, but that was his approach. And
Yep.
I started taking that approach too as a kid. My son started doing that naturally too.
Yes.
The girls didn't, and it took. They were older when that occurred to them, and I don't think it occurred naturally. I think it was a learned behavior with them.
Right. And in essence, he was striving for status.
Right. And he was problem solving.
Yes.
I want X. Mom
Exactly.
says I can't have X. Maybe there's another way to get this.
You got it.
And yeah, and it was kind of neat because it made me not the bad guy.
There you go.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel lucky in a way because I was never really faced with a situation of having to make the decision whether to be a corporal punishment parent or a non-corporal punishment parent, because nothing ever came up that put that decision in front of me. There was always another way to deal with things well before it would have gotten to that level.
Huh. Good.
Yeah.
Great.
So yeah, leading by example.
I think it was partly because I noticed that tendency, though.
Interesting.
Right. So this is something that I think that moms in general could definitely get. Obviously, if you have dad around, this is going to make all of this way easier and better, not only for you and your significant other, but also especially for your kids, both your sons and your daughters, because you want to make sure that they're all getting what they need. So yeah, I think this is all very, very important stuff and very useful. Lastly, I guess I want to know if you have any tips for mothers that are looking to raise boys that we haven't actually covered, that maybe that we didn't talk about, like the way that they process pain, if they're having problems in school, that kind of thing that you may have mentioned in your book. I know you do have a chapter on tips, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, the tips for parents is learn to love your child for the unique being that he or she is, and then go from there. I mean, when we can kind of honor our children as being really unique and different in their own way, no matter what they are, then we're in better shape to discipline, to be close, to tell stories, to do anything. But the first step is kind of loving them for who they are, not for who we want them to be.
Yeah. I think those are good words. Let me see if Allison, are you around? Allison, do you want to take us out?
I think she said she can't talk.
She said she's actually not available. Oh, so if you want to close it. Oh, so I have to do it. Okay. Sorry about that. I have to do it. Okay, it's on my shoulders. Well, if you guys like the kind of content that we're making, I personally really enjoyed this show. I wish we could have gone much longer. I want to really present us trying to get to know boys better. It's something that you just don't hear this conversation when it comes to trying to understand male nature, and as early as possible with as much curiosity and compassion as you can, possibly muster. And I think that these conversations are vitally important, and they're actually going to be far more productive than the ones that you normally get, which are the conversation around how there's something toxic about masculinity, how there's something destructive about high levels of testosterone, and that there isn't a desire to understand where it comes from. Instead, there's simply a desire to muzzle it, control it, medicate it, sedate it, but not actually understand it and encourage it and try to grow the parts of it that are very positive and try to understand and maybe sort of extinguish the parts that could be negative or destructive. Because it can happen with boys or girls because they're individuals, but we have to recognize that these things are behaviors, and some of them should be encouraged and some of them should be discouraged. And that won't happen unless we understand boys better. So I want to thank you, Tom, for writing this book. I'm going to finish reading it. I am really enjoying it so far, and I think it's actually got some really interesting stuff in there. So if you guys could check it out, allow me to repeat the title. It's kind of a mouthful. Helping Mothers Be Closer to Their Sons, Understanding the Unique World of Boys. You can get it on Amazon right now. So, Tom, do you have any final words that you want to say?
No, I like the way you closed out. I'm with you 100%. And thank you for having me. I've had fun tonight.
Oh, well, thank you for joining us, and thank you, Hannah, for talking a little bit about your experiences as a mother. And I thought that was really insightful and useful.
Yeah, it's very powerful.
You know, I know Mike didn't talk much, but he's totally here. Hi, Mike. And
yeah, hi. Hi, everyone.
Let me ask you a question, though, Mike, real quick. Did you have both of your parents for most of your life?
Yeah, they're still together and everything. I'm one of the lucky ones.
That is great. I did have my mother and father for a good chunk of it until I was about 18, and then they separated. And but that overall, I think if my father wasn't there, I probably would have turned out a lot worse, because he saved me from, you know, some stuff that my mom didn't understand, and I didn't really feel comfortable going to her about.
Right.
That I only felt like my father could help me with. So, you know, I will say that, you know, the ideal would be to have both parents in the home. But we're living in the real world where that's just not always the case. So we have to try to give single parents the tools that they can use that are actually going to be helpful not only to them, but to their sons.
Yes.
So I think this is one of those tools. And I guess that's it. I'm going to close it out. Leave a comment. Tell us about your young life. If you have kids, are any of these things that we said of use to you? And if there's anything that you have found that's even more useful, that was either something that you were raised with or something that you raise your children with, leave a comment and tell us about it. I'd like to see your techniques and your experiences. And otherwise, we'll see you guys next time on Honey Badger Radio. Thank you again.
Good deal.